My name is Joseph Britton. I'm the Dean of the Berkeley Divinity School, and it's a pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here on this beautiful October afternoon for the Francis Cheney Lecture. This is on the occasion of the sesquicentennial, or the 150th anniversary of the founding of Berkeley Divinity School, so it is not only a celebration of the life and witness of Francis Cheney, but also of the entire school. During his years at Berkeley Yale, Francis Cheney worked diligently to build a learned ministry. In his teaching, preaching, and manner of life, he continually reminded those who knew him that the proper focus of the minister's training is pastoral care. Professor Cheney strove to impress upon his students that a truly well-educated clergy is one which knows how to use its knowledge to nourish all manner of people, that the measure of learning is the charitable actions to which it gives rise, that, quite simply, true piety is acting what one knows. In recognition of and in thanksgiving for Professor Cheney's quietly compelling ministry here at the Berkeley Divinity School and Yale Divinity School, his students and friends joined together to establish the Francis X. Cheney Lectureship in Pastoral Theology. The lectureship is open to scholars in all disciplines who seek to bring their expertise to bear on the subject of pastoral care. In this way, Professor Cheney's students and friends hoped to ensure the continuance at Berkeley Yale of his own ministry, which was always an endeavor to transcend doctrinal and vocational differences, and so to address the central concern of the minister as a member of the Christian community, that is, the care of the whole people of God. This year's Cheney lecturer is the Reverend Dr. Mark McIntosh, Associate Professor of Theology at Loyola University, Chicago. Professor McIntosh, a native of Chicago, received his BA in history from Yale University in 1982 and did theology degrees at Oxford University and the General Theological Seminary. And I might just add as a tangent that Mark and I were together at General, and in those days we used to sneak away from Chelsea Square to the Yale Divinity School in order to expand our horizons of biblical scholarship. So you can interpret that as you will. Professor McIntosh took his PhD in theology from the University of Chicago, writing on the doctrine of the Incarnation in Hans Urs von Balthasar. He has since published this study under the title Christology from Within, as well as the book Mysteries of Faith in the Church's New Teaching Series, and Mystical Theology, the Integrity of Spirituality and Theology, in the Blackwell series on Challenges in Contemporary Theology. He is a member of the Theology Committee of the House of Bishops of the Episcopal Church, canon theologian to the presiding bishop, and a chaplain to the House of Bishops, where he is well known and respected for the emphasis he brings to the centrality of God in prayer and worship, as well as the importance of sound theological reflection. Based on this example, we are especially pleased to have Professor McIntosh with us this afternoon to address the provocative and perhaps even unsettling topic, how God makes theologians. Professor McIntosh.
Thank you very much, and thank you for welcoming me here. It's a great privilege and an honor to be back here, and I'm very grateful to all of you for making it possible. I'm not sure whether I'll be addressing all the needs of a proper Cheney lecturer, but I'll try my best to make sure that what God does to our minds becomes clear in how we act as pastors. But it's only fair to warn you, in my view, just about the worst thing that could happen to a Christian theologian is for any of us to be taken too seriously. I don't mean to imply that you and I are all farcical figures, of course. Perhaps we could be better compared to children waiting, studiously cautious, not intending to get wet, but magnificently unended by the vast, joyful rolling of the tide. The tide pulling at theologians is God, trying to get us to float, even swim, or at least admit that we have no business floundering along on 2 feet in such a current. I picture theologians this way, myself included, because we are essentially hapless folk, ever prone to manage and clarify what remains mercifully beyond our grasp. Such divine currents as we paddle about in, grace, for example, or forgiveness, or resurrection, are right down to the last filaments of eternal glory, entirely unnecessary, unexpected, and undeserved. The ordinary cycles of our everyday lives, by contrast, are sometimes relatively predictable. They amble amiably along into the charts and scholarly monographs in which we would render them as subjects of study. Most of us, contemporary theologians, soberly trained in the best scholarly methods, try our hardest to analyze the divine realities by dutifully herding them into the approved pens of arguments and critical studies. And then every once in a while, when we do risk opening our mouths to discourse of deity, out come skirling parables, hopelessly impossible histories, and such reckless extravagances as a God who refuses to stay pristinely divine, and a Savior who's such a miserable failure he cannot even save himself. As the Apostle Paul said, the whole thing really does seem comically weak and foolish by any human standard you like. So who can blame us if we theologians try to remain inconspicuous? The danger is that we will attempt to blend in all too well. We will master the academic and ecclesiastical art so proficiently that our success might mask our deeper haplessness. As we will manage in such times, perhaps without realizing it, to substitute for the outlandishness of Christian faith a gray banality in which nothing unexpected ever happens or ever could. But every once in a great while, theologians of such good humor and humility come along that they're content to teach the truth about God precisely by letting the ludicrous inadequacies of their art appear in broad daylight. I think of the words once written by Karl Barth in the midst of writing his voluminous efforts in theology. He paused to remark, and this is his language, I haven't attempted to adapt it, "If anyone should not find himself astonished and filled with wonder when he becomes involved in one way or another with theology, he would be well advised to consider once more from a certain remoteness and without prejudice what is involved in this undertaking. The same holds true for any who should have accomplished the feat of no longer being astonished, instead of becoming continually more astonished all the time that he concerns himself with this subject. When he reconsiders the subject, however, such a person might find that astonishment wells up within him anew, or perhaps even for the first time. And this time such wonder might not desert him, but might rather become increasingly powerful in him. That astonishment should remain or become wholly foreign to him is scarcely conceivable. But should that happen, both he and theology would fare better if he would devote his time to some other occupation. If such astonishment is lacking, the whole enterprise of even the best theologian would canker at the roots. On the other hand, as long as even a poor theologian is capable of astonishment, he is not lost to the fulfillment of his task. I'd like to suggest that this recurring astonishment that theologians suffer has everything to do with the reality we seek to understand. Why? What is it about theology that requires such attention to the impact its subject matter has upon us, its students? After all, studying the properties of, say, chemical compounds doesn't turn you into the chemicals you are studying, nor do we imagine that such metamorphosis would greatly assist the process of understanding. The trouble and astonishment of theology is that something like this does, or at least potentially can happen. A mysterious affinity kindles between theology's object and theologians. As this happens, theologians start to catch glimpses of reality, shimmering and beckoning far beyond the proper frames and disciplines of theology itself, like children playing at the water's edge. Theologians find themselves tugged by the tide and tumbled by waves that delight and lure them deeper. This certainly happens, or should happen, in theology. And yet I'm afraid that there is something yet more unsettling going on. Consider by analogy the difference between studying the chemical composition of a rock and studying the psychology of a human person. It's true that in both cases, good students, good scholars will grow fascinated by their objects of study and devoted to the truth about them that they're seeking to discover and understand. Really great scholars might even speak about trying to learn from the rock or the human person, about letting the object of study become their teacher, in a sense. But this is clearly going to happen in quite different ways in the two cases. The rock will speak only by means of an enigmatic, if somewhat solemn and undeniably stony silence. But the human person will be a much more active participant in the work, not simply filling out forms corresponding to the scholar's research templates, but perhaps interrupting, correcting, transforming through conversation everything the scholar may have thought were the real data. And what if the person you were studying had specially peculiar habits, like severe sleepwalking, or refusing to talk with you except over gargantuan meals of fresh mussels in which you were required to partake? Pretty soon, if you really wanted to understand, you might begin to develop new habits yourself, allowing you to study your sleepwalking mussel eater more adroitly and naturally. At first, you would tell yourself, I'm not really a nocturnal person, and I really don't like mollusks of any kind whatsoever. And yet there you are every evening gorging with your research subject on mussels and trailing along a few hours later through the darkness on the nightly ramble. What has happened? You have become, at least for study purposes, a learner, an apprentice to the object of your study, who has in fact become your teacher. And for a while at least you have acquired something of a new way of being, new habits of existence that fit you for your study encounters. We could call these new habits your sleepwalking mussel eater research virtues. They are the dispositions that allow you a certain flourishing and even excellence as a student of sleepwalking mussel eaters. But now suppose that your research subject were even more peculiar still. Suppose the first time you approached, this person astonishingly told you the truth about yourself, both the truth you had been afraid to admit and a yet deeper truth you had never known and yet somehow always longed to hear. Over time, such a research subject might engender a fair portion of both humility and hope within you. Suppose that this person was so available for you, so vulnerably honest and self-disclosing, and showed such fidelity to your own work that you began to develop a high degree of faith in the person's essential goodness and reliability. And suppose that over time you began to catch glimpses of your research subject, helping others with such generosity and breathtaking selflessness that you began to be inspired yourself, feeling a kindred sort of love for people, and gradually finding yourself able to converse with your subject more freely, to understand more deeply, as you yourself began to sense something of this passion your subject had for others. In such a case, you would indeed be studying by a kind of apprenticeship, with your subject as your true teacher. Moreover, the research virtues that would have begun to grow in you, those habits equipping you to succeed in just being around and understanding this person, those virtues would have truly begun to transform you. Faith and hope and love, taking root in you, would point to a remarkable subject of study. Thomas Aquinas, of course, called such habits the theological virtues, for they turn out to equip one to participate in a theological life, a life of theologia, of speech and meaning and truth about God and astonishingly with God. These dispositions are the making of theologians, for they are the impact that this subject has upon those who draw near. As Thomas puts it, these theological virtues are the way God's life recreates a human life, as that human life partakes in God's life, quote, as kindled wood partakes of the nature of fire. So this is why it's worth talking a bit about what, or better, who it is that makes theologians. Because it offers us a glimpse of this research subject who makes such an impression on us theologians. Indeed, a subject who is in us, says Thomas, like fire is in wood. We notice that unlike having a rock or a sleepwalking muscle eater as a research subject, the theologian is trying to engage with someone who seems to be supremely free, whose mystery is only available to the researcher by an act of free self-disclosure that is most likely to be visible in the peculiar influence it has upon the researcher's own life. It will end soon, I have every confidence. This subject is not like a lab specimen or even someone you can coax into the research program with the promise of a free meal. And that's probably what makes us theologians seem so hapless sometimes. The deepest truth of the one we seek to understand is only expressible sometimes, we hope, we pray, in the transformations of our own lives. Now, at this point, I'd like to sketch briefly some turning points in such a theological life. Turning points that should give us a sense of what Christians think happens to those whom God lures into encounter, and how that gives rise to all the various ideas that we have about that one. And I've divided this into several sections, and we can pick and choose as you like, although probably it would be awkward to take a show of hands here. When I've offered this before, I'll tell you in advance that one section in particular always gets lots of requests until I get midway into it, and then I can see the disillusionment creeping upon people's faces as they realize it wasn't what they thought. But I've entitled this section, Theologians as Adventurers, as Pirates, as Mystics, and as sages. And of course, undergraduates always want to hear the piratical section, but they're usually disappointed. Anyway, we'll start in at the beginning and see where we may make it through adventure at least. In the middle of World War II Europe, Simone Weil was writing about beauty and the order of the world. She was a brilliant adventurer, traveling ad venturam, Latin for towards the future, and she was speaking of being lured by a reality more real than the shabby and brutal pseudo-reality that was consuming people all around her. In her view, this devouring world leaks out from a strange dislocation of the world, separation from truth. A dislocation that befalls us whenever individuals or nations or causes place themselves at the center of everything and try to make the rest revolve around themselves. She wrote, quote, "We live in a world of unreality and dreams. To give up our imaginary position as the center, to renounce it not only intellectually but in the imaginative part of our soul, that means to awaken to what is real and eternal, to see the true light and hear the true silence. A transformation then takes place at the very roots of our sensibility, in our immediate reception of sense impressions and psychological impressions." Simone Weil was convinced that only if human beings were lured out of themselves into the larger selves they have yet to discover, would they make contact with the really real. Not that the human ego is unreal, but that its mapping of everything in terms of itself sometimes distorts reality and diminishes it merely to the extent of the ego's grasp. But if the eye catches a glimpse of something immeasurably beautiful, something awesomely beyond any grasp, then humankind may become adventurous and escape the tidy prison of its small certainties. Quote, "A transformation then takes place at the very roots of our sensibility," says Weil. The very way such a person relates to the world becomes different, mysteriously lamed, like Jacob after wrestling with an angel. Another thinker, possibly the most influential Christianity has ever produced, noticed, like Weil, this curious link between egocentric possessiveness and narrowness of understanding. In his masterwork, The Trinity, Augustine describes the soul's anxiety to possess more and more for itself as leading it, tragically, to perceive less and less of what is really there. Quote, "The soul, loving its own power, slides away from the whole, which is common to all, into the part which is its own private property. By following God's directions and being perfectly governed by God's laws, it could enjoy the whole universe of creation. But by the apostasy of pride, which is called the beginning of sin, it strives to grab something more than the whole and to govern it by its own laws. And because there is nothing more than the whole, it is thrust back into anxiety over a part. And so, by being greedy for more, it gets less. It drags the deceptive semblances of bodily things inside itself and plays about with them in idle meditation until it cannot even think of anything divine except as being such." Augustine's own personal series of often painful conversions left him acutely aware of the self's deceptive cunning and its tendency to cocoon itself within ego-gratifying fantasies of every kind. The result, says Augustine, is a barely noticeable shriveling of reality, even the reality of God, to the constraints of the mind's own concepts, imaginative constructs. The possibility that reality could be gloriously larger than this is conceivable to such a mind only as a threat. Theology, in the deepest sense, is the complete reversal of this. It is when the theologian, lured by ungraspable truth, ceases to devour everything and is herself or himself devoured or transformed by a reality too real to be, in Augustine's terms, dragged back into the mind's manipulations. In Simone Weil's view, it is like an adventure into a labyrinth. Quote, "The beauty of the world is the mouth of a labyrinth. The unwary individual who, on entering, takes a few steps is soon unable to find the opening. worn out with nothing to eat or drink in the dark, separated from his dear ones and from everything he loves and is accustomed to, such a one walks on without knowing anything or hoping anything, incapable even of discovering whether he's really going forward or merely turning round. But this affliction is as nothing compared with the danger threatening him. For if he does not lose courage, if such a one goes on walking, it is absolutely certain that that one will finally arrive at the center of the labyrinth, and there God is waiting to eat him. Later he will go out again, but he will be changed. Such a one will have become different after being eaten and digested by God. Afterward, that one will stay near the entrance so that he can gently push all those who come near into the opening. End of quote. There are places and times in one's life, Faye seems to be saying, when we are lured beyond our customary view of the world. We become entranced by a poet or a child we know approaches death, or we realize in the face of someone's forgiveness how much we have hurt him, or a vibration of iridescent green hummingbird hovers for a moment before our eyes. In such moments, a journey may begin from which we will never come back as we used to be. Christians believe that such a moment as this overtook Jesus' first followers shortly after his crucifixion. They wandered into a labyrinth, an empty tomb, and although they seemed simply to follow a trail of their own collapsing expectations, infidelities, and betrayals, they were accosted instead by a love and forgiveness so intensely alive that they could not believe it was the same one who had died until he showed them his hands and his side. They thought they were consuming his life, but the more he gave himself into their hands, take, eat, this is my body, the more they seemed to be taken into his life, taken up to become his body. Theology, in the truest sense, begins with that adventure, that conversion or transformation towards a new way of experiencing and understanding reality. While we may very well study Christian theology without having this happen to ourselves, we will never really see what theology is about until and unless we recognize that true theologians see everything from this new perspective, from this sharing in the dying and rising of Jesus. What do you think? Do you want piracy, or do you want to go on to theologians as mystics? Mystics. I think we'll leave piracy. It's all about analogical speech and theologians stealing words that they think are under their control and finding out that they're really God's words and things like that. You know all that. Let's talk about theologians as mystics. Suppose that you are a character in a play. Let's say a tragic comedy. I don't mean you're an actor portraying one of the roles, but simply yourself actually a character in a play. And you come to a crisis point. Of course, you don't necessarily realize that you're a character in a play. You think this is really happening. You come to a crisis point with everyone on the verge of taking revenge on everything else for an endless string of wrongs. And just then, another person appears. And whenever she moves among you, people stop quarreling. They seem less afraid of each other or of what will happen to them if they let go of the hatreds that they have for so long allowed to define themselves. Astonished, you ask her how this comes about. I've been showing people how much they are loved and how much they have to live for, she says. But some of the people are angry at the disruption she causes in their usual patterns, and they do away with her. Later, however, you see her again, alive. How can this be, you ask? Because I am the living voice of your author, she says, the source of your life too. You cannot really silence me, because I am echoing in every word and thought that you have. Only you have been too frightened and angry to hear the voice clearly, and so I am speaking to you directly, person to person. Over time, as you listen to her, you begin to understand what it means that you too are a character with an author. The more attuned to the author's speaking you become, the more alive, the more yourself you come to feel, as the purpose and truth of yourself grows more luminous within you. Yes, says the woman, it is just because you had all forgotten that you had an author and could no longer sense the author's glad giving of everything to you that you became fearful and envious, threatened and threatening to one another. Christians believe that Jesus of Nazareth is the living voice in our world of the author of all life, speaking to humanity as a fellow human being. Companionship with Christ in this view leads to the conversion of people towards the truth of the author's deep desire for them. But just so far as the world has become deaf to the infinitely giving voice, the world has distorted persons' characters, so that they draw their identity not from the author's giving of them to themselves, but from the fearful cycles of the world. This means that rediscovery of one's true identity, one's true character as a beloved, will entail a kind of death. One will no longer draw a pretend life from the drives and urgencies of the world, but directly again from the living voice of the divine author of life. And this will be a resurrection, the true self appearing anew, luminously filled and brimming with the spirit or desire of the author. Theology does not simply think about these things. It has to think by means of them. With a theological mind that has died and is now alive in Christ, drawing its mode of reflection from Christ. In other words, theologians themselves have to share in the mystical life, the life in which the hidden presence of God, as the voice speaking all things into existence, can be sensed and acknowledged in all things. Mystical just means hidden. It comes from the Greek verb muo, to close or shut. Notice that this does not mean things do not have their own reality. They are really there as mountains or dragonflies or football teams, and they can be studied in terms of their geological formation or cultural significance by means of any other disciplines that apply. But theology wants to consider all these things, indeed everything, precisely in terms of each thing's mystical identity as a character in the play of the universe, or, to use standard theological language, as a creature that is ceaselessly spoken by the Creator. Early Christian thinkers believed that would-be theologians could and should prepare themselves for this mystical dimension of theology. The great teacher of New Christians, Origen of Alexandria, and another influential theorist of Christian spiritual life, Evagrius of Pontus, both adapted a standard philosophical training pattern for Christian theological needs. In fact, there was a common element shared by the pedagogy of early Christian theology and ancient philosophy, namely, the understanding that what is essential is the way of life and spiritual exercises by which a person grows and deepens in one's character, becomes capable over time of more profound understanding. The specific teachings or doctrines of theology or of philosophy are really not an independent expression of the theology or philosophy, but are meant rather as a manual or a guide to assist learners as they undertake a theological life. The truth and understanding one seeks is found in the transforming practices of one's theological life, and not only or not primarily in the written digest or reference work that summarizes them, which I guess tells me I may be spending too much time writing books. The first step in this view would be for theologians in training to live into the continual conversion by which one moves, by means of Christ's dying and rising, from life dominated by fears, compulsions, and self-regarding desires to a life that draws its freedom and clarity from the living spring of God's self-giving. Otherwise, says Origen, a person used to seeing everything as either a threat or a potential possession will not know, quote, how to hear love's language in purity, and will twist the whole manner of that one's hearing away from the truth, away, end of quote, away from God's intention. Everything will sound with only the petty, shrill clamor of one's own cravings or fears, rather than the deep resonance of the divine voice. As this moral and ascetical dimension of theology deepens, the theologian is enabled to consider everything from the freely giving perspective of the Creator. And from this perspective, the theologian is enabled to begin hearing the divine speaking in all things, which we humans encounter as the meaning or truth of each thing. We could say that this is a new sensitivity to the inner logic of each thing. These early Christians called this the contemplation of nature, the hearing of the divine logos, the word or truth or meaning that speaks as the inner logoi or rational principles of all things. At first, such a theologian would, perhaps in our era, simply hear these logoi, little words, as the, say, chemical formulae of an item, or the DNA of a living cell, or the logical principles of an economic structure. But a theologian who is truly trained to hear all these things precisely as creatures will also hear this chemical formula or DNA or logical principle as none other than the creaturely speaking of the divine word, the divine giving of each thing freely its particular truth. As Andrew Louth puts it, the soul, quote, begins by contemplating the natural order itself, then it rises beyond this and discerns the principles which lie behind it. Since the universe is created by the Word of God, this is to enter into the mind of the Word. And for Origen, this is like falling in love and beginning to recognize the signs or traces or voice of one's beloved in the world around one. The theologian, in Origen's words, quote, comes to ponder and consider the beauty and grace of all things that have been created in this word, and seeing in them the continually, freely giving life of their author, the theologian will awaken to the grandeur of their brightness and will be enkindled with the blessed fire of God's love. End of quote. This natural contemplation, a kind of hearing of the divine voice in everything, becomes a training, says Origen, for the ultimate form of contemplation, which Origen's successors called theology, the more direct and immediate hearing of the divine speaking, theologia. As Origen hints, this ultimate form of theology is awakened and aroused by the divine loving at work within the theologian's own life, bringing the theologian to understand everything more and more from within the knowing and loving of all, which is God's life. In Evagrius's famous phrase, if you are a theologian, you truly pray, and if you truly pray, you are a theologian. Communing with the theologos, the divine word, apprenticed theologians begin to notice the echo of this divine speaking in everything. And as this deeper recognition and understanding grows, they're enabled all the more to enter into this God talk. It is as though the divine Logos, speaking to theologians in and through all things, is teaching them some of this divine language, allowing them to converse, to pray, to see the universe itself as logikos, structured with meaning and truth and beauty. What Origen and Evagrius are describing, I think, is the moment when theologians realize that the concept, or logos, by means of which they are thinking, is itself the divine thought. Or put another way, the light by which we have begun to see everything begins to be identifiable as God's own radiance. We cannot look at this light directly, for it is far too bright. But we can begin to see everything by means of it as it illuminates everything. Perhaps this sounds outlandish to you, but there are many everyday parallels. For example, I enjoy going to an art museum, even though I know painfully little about art. When I look at the paintings and reflect on them, my mind does so by means of a few fuzzy and imperfectly formed ideas. As a consequence, while I may enjoy the paintings at a very basic level, I have to admit that there is a lot in them that I don't really see. Of course, I literally see the same pigments on the canvas that everyone else sees. I'm not colorblind, but I often have a feeling of mingled yearning and frustration, sensing I'm missing something. One time, however, I went with an art historian who is herself also an artist. And for a few bright hours, she shared her way of thinking about painting with me as we walked through the gallery. And my mind came to life with a whole new set of concepts, ideas, ways of looking and feeling about art, and more to the point, I saw things I had never seen before. Even though I still don't fully understand everything my friend taught me, my mind began to come alive, to think by means of her thinking, and to see things by means of those ideas that I couldn't really perceive or understand before. Now, my strong hunch is that this is exactly analogous to the kind of theological formation of mind we've been talking about for theologians. The divine artist who knows the hidden principles of beauty by which all things exist, begins to share this way of thinking, of artistry, with apprentice theologians. And gradually their minds become animated and awakened by this way, and they begin to understand everything they see by means of these ideas. But of course, in God's case, the ideas we're really talking about are really themselves simply God. Thus, God becomes, so to speak, the living structure of a theologian's thinking, present at the very knowing and loving by which the theologian understands reality, and at the same time realizing, making alive the mind that thinks by means of these living ideas. As I said above, for Aquinas and for most of the Christian tradition, the ultimate form of this kind of seeing by means of the divine ideas is the vision of God that blesses or beatifies all who gaze within the divine life. As Herbert McCabe, a British Dominican, once summarized Thomas's view, when in beatitude a person understands the essence of God, the mind is not realized by a form, an idea or concept, which is a likeness of God, but by God, God's self. God will not simply be an object of our minds, but the actual life by which our minds are what they will have become. Of course, this is the ultimate state of theology, a sharing in God's own life that Christians believe only the blessed in heaven have now to enjoy. Yet my whole point has been that apart from some preliminary and provisional form of this thinking by means of God's thinking, even now, theologians will think about even very religious things with minds that are still closed to the fullness of their reality. We may think about very religious things, but fail to think by means of God's own thinking. Every theologian needs to be open to the possibility of continual conversion to the ever greater mystery of God, and all who really undertake theology, while not perhaps needing to become mystics themselves, will best understand theology if they can sense what Christians experience as the tide of mystical life flowing towards God. The Cistercian theologian William of Saint-Thierry notes that every once in a while people are shown a certain light of God's countenance, so that, quote, what they are allowed to glimpse for a passing moment may set the soul on fire with longing for full possession of eternal light, the inheritance of full vision of God. Thank you.